the Bliss Business Podcast, the show about empathy, connection, and consciousness in business. Today's episode is brought to you by Zero Company, your paid search, social media, and programmatic ad experts.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. I'm Steven Sakash here once again with my co-host, Tulio Siragusa, and we've got a special guest who we'll introduce in a moment. So entrepreneurship is often described through those exciting milestones, the launch, maybe a funding round, the growth curve, an acquisition or an exit. But most of business happens in that long middle area. And that's where owners wrestle with, cash flow, hiring, pricing, debt, market shifts. Those are pain, customer pressure, and the emotional weight of being responsible for all of this in the company's future. And in that middle stage, emotional intelligence becomes more than a leadership skill. It kind of becomes a survival skill. So today we are exploring emotional intelligence for durable growth. And Tulio, introduce our guest today.
I don't hear Tulio. Do you?
Nope. I can't hear him.
I should try to unmute myself. That might work better. Okay. It'll be my pleasure. Today's guest is Brad Poulos. He's a business professor, entrepreneur advisor, and author. Brad has more than 30 years of experience building, scaling, fixing, and sometimes shutting down companies. He has grown businesses from startup to more than $75 million in revenue, led publicly traded firms, negotiated major financing and contracts, and guided companies through restructuring, turnarounds, and acquisitions. Alongside his operating career, Brad has taught entrepreneurship and finance at Toronto Metropolitan University for more than 15 years, working with founders who are beyond the idea stage and facing the reality of running a business. He is also the author of the Small Business Operator's Manual and Most Problems Solve Themselves, where his work focuses on clarity, durability, growth, cash flow, decision-making, and building businesses that do not consume their owners. Welcome to the Bliss Business Podcast, Brad. Good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Brad, I can't wait to getting into the conversation on the Most Problems Solve Themselves book. But really, first, from your perspective, why does emotional intelligence matter so much once a company moves beyond that initial startup buzz and into the realities of operating?
Well, first of all, I'm going to take a little bit of issue with the premise of the question because I think emotional intelligence helps at every stage. It certainly helps a lot at the startup stage where I, most of my teaching is built around that. Although most of my private practice is with companies that are a little bit more established. There's a handful of models that we talk about in the program, in the entrepreneurship program at Toronto Metropolitan University. And so one of the things we teach early on is this notion of adversity quotient. And it's exactly what it sounds like. If you're familiar with the Big Five personality profile tool, it kind of maps, it's negatively correlated with the negative emotion element of that, which is one of the things that you do not want to see in an entrepreneur or a business operator. That's the ability to deal with when things go wrong, to not get fussed by it and all of that, that sort of stuff. The other thing is the notion of internal locus of control. So believing that you are the pilot in the plane of your own life, right? You're not a passenger. You're driving your life. You're in charge of it. You have a high amount of control over where your life is going. Now, that doesn't mean that every single day there aren't a few things that come at you that you didn't anticipate and that you certainly couldn't control, but it's more about how you deal with it. And the best entrepreneurs and the people who are the most successful are ones that are able to deal with that without it, derailing their day too much.
So Brad, continuing on this theme, you've built, you've scaled, you've fixed, and occasionally even shut down companies. Yeah. So what does emotional intelligence look like when a leader has to make those kind of hard calls?
It's toughness, I think, combined with some level of compassion usually, because when we're making the kind of decisions you're talking about, they're almost always going to affect other people as well. that maybe if you're closing a business, there's going to be employees that are probably going to lose their job. Or if you're taking a business in another direction, there may be suppliers, and often they're small business people. These are going to be decisions that are going to affect them, in fairly significant way. But you have to have, the intestinal fortitude to make the right decision, because carrying on with a business that's not working isn't really doing anybody any favors. You're just delaying the inevitable anyway. So probably better to deal with it right away. But like I say, having some compassion. And actually, there's a really great book. Have you guys heard of Radical Candor?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So I live that every day, and I've had it practiced on me as well, long before I ever read the book. Actually, can I tell you a quick story about it?
Yeah.
Actually, it's kind of instructive. Yeah, so I was doing my very first set of performance reviews back when I was in my late 20s and still working at a big company. First time I had been a manager, I'd spent 5 or 6 years in as an individual contributor, and got a job, my first real management job. And I was doing performance reviews for I supervised a bunch of technicians, and so I was doing their performance reviews, and I just finished the review of my star employee, and he had previously been a peer, and we had a great relationship. We got along really well, even though he had applied for the same job I had gotten and hadn't been successful. Showed no resentment. He was, like I say, it was just an absolutely star employee. So I did his review, and I very dramatically pushed it to the corner of the desk. And I said, okay, his name was Greg. I said, okay, Greg, you're done now. So do me a favor. How about you review me? And he said, are you sure, Brad? Like, yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. No, Brad, are you sure? Right? And he literally asked me 3 times. And finally, I'm like, geez, Greg, like, just let me have it. And he said, well, Brad, you're an effing tyrant. And I'm like, what? He goes, oh, yeah. He goes, like, sometimes I don't even recognize you. And because he was my friend, he was nice enough kind enough, sorry, nice is the wrong word. He was kind enough to share that with me. And so, I could have done one of 2 things. I could have said, he's just a jerk. And, just pushed it aside. But I didn't. I took it in. And a couple things. One, I checked with him a year later when we were doing our performance reviews, and I was no longer a tyrant. So I had managed to fix a few things with some help from my boss, actually, because I was open with him. But then, like, that's about almost 30 years ago. And so after I read the book Radical Candor, and I started giving a few talks about it, and I thought, I better call Greg and get his permission to use his name. So I did. And we had a great talk. It had been, almost 30 years, I think, since we had spoken. And I asked him a couple questions. I said, first of all, when you look back on me as a boss, I didn't tell him about what he had said, but I said, when you look back on me as a boss, like, what comes in your mind? He goes, oh my God, you're like one of the best bosses I ever had. So that, but the real telling thing, and this is, I think, the most important lesson here for the audience, is that those 4 words were life-changing for Brad. I will never forget those 4 words. That was a quote. I didn't tell you that. I didn't say it exactly the way he did, but so I asked him, like, do you remember that? And he didn't. So that, you can have one sentence that comes out of your mouth that literally changes the life, negatively or positively, for the person you're talking to, and it's a non-issue for you. So it kind of reinforced for me the importance of be careful with your words, because you never know the impact that they can have.
It's interesting to me with that is to have sort of this healthy business system, you've got to have like this portion of that as a feedback loop of some type or whatever. But if there's not like that psychological safety at all in there, like he asked you 3 times, he was like, I'm not sure I want to do it. There's people right now out there who'd be like, oh, hell no, I'd never be able to ask that of my person because I know that's going to, come back to me with my manager during that review.
Well,
but
it's important to remember radical candor. Actually, it's normally practiced down like from above, but in that case, it is when it's best done. It's practiced in all directions.
Yeah.
So
and you gotta have kind of that sort of agreement in place, right? In the culture that you're in, is that it's fully acceptable, and this is the better way to operate. But
yeah, I think that's also one of the reasons why most CEOs or executives should have coaches, because that's their role, is to play that transparent. Let me give you the reflection in a truthful way, because that's what you've hired me to do. Because quite often it's hard for employees to do that. To have that kind of transparency, it's hard. There was like, is this a trick question? Is this going to come and bite me later? So it's difficult. The fact that he was able to open up to you obviously showed a tremendous amount of trust in you, but most don't do that. They always worry, like, I don't know. But when when you have a coach that you hire, it's like, give me my blind spots, then they'll tell you the truth,
Yeah, that's a great point. I can really drive that one home too, because before we sold out to the public, so I sold my company to a public company and I became the CEO of the public company. So then I had a board and I had some people to answer to. But prior to that, it was just myself and two other partners, and I was the president of the company. And I joined a CEO group, one of these groups of 10 CEOs that gets together once a month. There's different formats, but ours was one afternoon a month, including lunch. And I loved it because it was the closest thing I had to a boss. So, and believe me, we let each other have it.
Yeah, those groups are amazing because part of the deal is to hold each other accountable and tell each other the truth.
Exactly.
That's why you join it, because otherwise, if you're not committed to understanding your blind spots, if you're ego-driven, you won't join those groups, because they're going to tell you you're a fool to think that this is right. And that's the gift of getting that reflection. It is a gift, but you have to be open to it, right? So, speaking of gifts, and what emotions often lead founders into poor decisions based on your experience? What should they look out for?
Oh, the 7 deadly sins, right? So anger, greed, anger for sure. So anger causes us to often do things that we probably ought not to do. And it's one of the reasons why I really, so I practice Zen Buddhism, but even if you're not into that, the primary kind of takeaway for me from Zen is is meditation and mindfulness. And you can do that. Anybody can do that. And it's interesting because I observed after practicing for several years that I still get angry, but now it's kind of a choice. Right? I'm kind of aware of it right before it happens. And so often, of course, able to, and that's the real payoff of mindfulness, often able to stifle it before it manifests itself in any kind of a negative way. But sometimes just decide to go for it, right? So, because I'm human, like anybody else. So I think anger is probably one of the big ones. Fear, as well. So, and that can show up in like so many different ways, right? So it's fear of making the wrong decision, so you don't make one at all. And one of my philosophies is there's almost no decision that isn't reversible. So just make the darn decision, don't off the pot, right? So and the example is that I often give when I'm trying to drive this home with people is Coke, when they changed the formula. Like, Coke changed the formula and changed it back. So don't tell me that whatever decision you're contemplating couldn't be undone if you figured out it was the wrong one. And of course you have to have the courage then, and that's another one of the emotions that doesn't get in the way, but that would more be an enabler. The courage to just admit that you're wrong. One of my favorite quotes is, I reserve the right to be wiser today than I was yesterday, and therefore I have the right to change my mind. And in the face of new information, it's only a fool that wouldn't. So, it's actually a sign of strength, I think, when you do an about face, when it's appropriate. Now, if you're constantly flip-flopping, then you're probably, you're displaying some leadership qualities that probably aren't going to be the most inspiring to your people. But doing it here and there, I think, is a sign of strength.
Yeah, it's a good point on the mindfulness too for leaders, so you don't get caught in the knee-jerk reaction of those emotions. You can feel those emotions, you feel them, but it's that pause, or it's that recognition, right, of, oh yeah, this is about to piss me off or something, right? Where you just, recognize it, step aside for a second and let that be what it's going to be. And then, pause and think about what your next, response will be. But
yeah, the other thing that, that I think that brings to the table is that, the notion of being present and accepting that, okay, today's a bad day. Like, just let it be a bad day. Right? Tomorrow will be another one. Like, every day won't be like this, but you don't, it doesn't have to ruin your life.
Yeah. It's hard when you're in the middle of it and you're not on the other side of it. When you're on the other side of it, you're like, okay, that wasn't, we got through it, right? We're still here. We're all healthy, hopefully. So Brad, one of the things we like to talk about on the show is systems in business, where we're talking about like building love into scalable systems. So the systems of kindness, systems of care, compassion that you can build into your business. And thinking about this, going from like a startup, our last guest we were talking to on the show, she was working like 90 hours a week at this early stage of her business. And it was, really before like kind of expanding and systemizing and having a little bit of trouble of letting go and being able to do that because of the type of business she was in. But what systems do you think are most important for building a company that does not consume its owner?
So any system that gets the owner out of the loop, and there's myriad of those, and it's to some degree it's going to be contextually, it's going to be specific to the context or to the situation. So so there's probably you and most of your audience have heard of this book, the E-Myth, and the number one takeaway from that book, of course, is working on the business, not in the business. So like when I go back to when I started a company with my brother, and I used to call myself quote boy because every quotation went through me, and that's a huge bottleneck, right? At some point you've got to get out of the way, and that applies to almost everything, maybe not signing the checks, but eventually actually even signing the checks. So before I sold my company, our controller signed the checks up to X thousands of dollars. I don't remember what the number was, but I was at the point where I wasn't even signing every check. We had 75 people and we were up well above, $50 million. So it's like I say, it's virtually anything where you are part of the operational loop. You've got to get yourself out.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that before the show today. I'm looking at my emails and I see, things coming across from employees, and I'm like, oh man, I remember I used to handle that. I used to handle this. I used to handle that. But when you're in the middle of it, it's really kind of hard to let go, I think. And so, she obviously she made that transition from that 90 hours and all. This is not sustainable.
I had an eye-opening experience when I did a turnaround once, and I was jettisoned into a small metal manufacturing company. And I'm a techie, like I come from the telecom industry, and I'm not a manufacturing person at all. And so actually not being burdened with the knowledge of how to do most of the things that we did inside that company was kind of liberating, because there was no really way for me to insert myself into the day-to-day kind of nitty-gritty processes, because I wouldn't have added any value whatsoever. And it was great because it allowed me to really work at a much higher level than I probably would have if it had been a business closer to the ones that I had run before.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Now, you've worked with founders and that are often past the idea stage of their business. So they're dealing with the realities of running the business day to day. We talked about this a little bit. What are the most common operational problems that quietly grow until they become serious? You mentioned about working on your business, not in the business, but what are the sort of red flags that these business owners should be looking out for? There's a little quiet stuff that are creeping up before they realize that they become big problems that they should be aware of.
Probably the biggest one is people. Is allowing people that probably either should be changed or changed to continue on because the owner doesn't want to deal with it. That's probably the biggest one and often the most egregious. So, and of course, a lot of people want to be nice, but I'm a firm believer in being kind. And often being kind means making difficult, tough decisions. And there's a iconic billionaire entrepreneur from Canada that most Americans haven't heard of him, but his name's Jimmy Pattison. And he started out in the car business, and now he owns a massive media company. Oh, he's probably 90 now, but his family's running it. He's still alive as far as I know. And there's a story about him that when he was starting in the car business, that every month he would fire the lowest salesperson on the totem pole, and then he would tell them that he was doing both of us a favor. And, I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, but I don't think it's a total exaggeration. So I'm sure, if the top salesman had a bad month and they happened to be at the bottom, I'm sure they weren't let go that month. But just as an idea, getting the right people into the right seats on the bus is super important. And that there's two elements to that kind of. So to me, the right people is values, because it's really difficult to teach values. I think you can to a small degree with really like junior employees, with people that are right out of school, because they're kind of sponges and they're trying to figure out how to make their way in the business world. So yeah, you can probably even shape their values a little bit, but certainly more senior employees. There's no way. I'm sorry. That's pretty much fixed. And so you've got to make sure that the values of the people align with the values of the owner and the firm. And then, so that's the right people. And then the right seat just means that they're in the right job, that you've got people that are capable and competent, have the right skills, and even the right mindset, sometimes the right personality. Like, so for example, if you're in customer service, that kind of takes not every personality is well suited to working in customer service, right? But in that case, as long as they have the right values, you can often train any if there's a shortcoming, you can often train around that, either with external training or maybe some on-the-job training or some hand-holding, or that kind of thing. So that's probably the biggest one. The biggest issue that I think, if I was to put it in one category, is probably something around cash flow. And often around collection. So I work almost exclusively with B2B type companies. So they're offering credit. I don't really deal with retailers or restaurants or that sort of thing. So they're offering credit to their customers, and maybe not that good at collections. So that, and then allowing cash to leak out of the business, which again is the other. That's the other piece of cash flow management.
So I mentioned earlier, wanted to talk about your book, Most Problems Solve Themselves. I think I can feel some people right now being like, wait, what the heck? Maybe give a little background on what you mean by that. And I think it's from the leadership kind of perspective, but really, like, what kind of problems actually do solve themselves, and which ones, require kind of, immediate leadership intervention.
Yeah, and that's the art, isn't it? It's knowing which is this problem in the 90% that solve themselves, or is it in the 10 where I actually do have to jump in and add some value. So where that comes from, so that's the name of the book. But as I mentioned to you earlier, it's not really what the entire book is about. The book is 52 discrete articles along a number of themes, management, operations, leadership, finance, entrepreneurship. So, and I just picked the title that I thought was kind of provocative, and I put that on the front cover, but that's not what the entire book is about. So that particular article, though, the real learning there is comes from when I was really, really busy and running my own company and traveling for close to half the time. I used to call it the parade. So I come back from a business trip. It's a Monday, and there was a parade outside my office, right, of people coming in with various problems. And so I adopted a philosophy where most of the time, if somebody brought me a problem, I would push it back on them. And I would just say, well, if I wasn't around, what would you do? And they would give me an answer, and I would say, well, you know what, then? I think we should do that. And I was training them a couple of things. So one, you don't have to, it wasn't so much like, don't bring me these problems because you're bothering me. It wasn't about that. It was more, you don't have to bring these problems to me because you're capable of solving themselves. I believe in you. I give you the autonomy to make the decision. And I will back you up. Even if it's not the decision I would have made. So what? That's okay. Even if it's not as good of a decision as I would have made, not everything in life has to be optimized. And if I want to, quote, optimize or add value to every single decision in the company, there's some real negative repercussions that come from that. So yeah, okay, my win is I get to make all the decisions, if you want to call that a win. But the loss is that, one, it takes up way too much time. Two, people that want to have autonomy, they're not getting it. And so your A players are going to go away. You're going to lose them. So you're going to have a company full of B players that want to be told what to do all day. And so that's really what that's about. Now, as I mentioned at the outset, the art is in knowing when this is really one I do need to jump on. And that's why it's not all problems solve themselves. It's only most, right?
It's interesting you talk about B players. A lot of times those B players, they've been held back. That's why they're B players. So you might end up with C players because the B players has often been marginalized. That's why they become B players. They're afraid. So let's talk a little bit about being purposeful, because everything you're talking about here, you've been advising owners through restructuring, turnarounds, acquisitions, difficult transitions. What should they be purposeful for? I know you talk about community, building trusted relationship. Why do those matter really the most during those difficult moments?
Well, for me, it kind of starts with your personal purpose first, right? So yeah, the company should have a purpose, and when you're going through your strategic planning, you should do vision, mission, values, all that wonderful stuff. And out of that kind of comes, the why of the company. But it should really start, I think, with your individual purpose. Like, what are you on earth here to do? And I think probably for a lot of owners of successful businesses, there's probably a couple of themes that commonly run through there. So one is just trying to make the world better. As I think it was Steve Jobs said something about leaving a dent in the world, right? So I kind of like that, leaving the world a better place. That's probably a big part of it. And then, like,
I don't think he meant one attached to it like a nuclear head, by the way. Let's clarify that.
No.
That's not the kind of dent he was talking about.
Fair enough. Yeah. All right. And then to some degree, like, this is, you got to be careful not to get carried away with this, but making your community better. So whether that's the local community, if you're a smaller company, giving back on some level. So sharing some of your profits, both with the employees who helped you get there. If I could redo capitalism, I would make the emphasis on shareholders a lot less strong. You have to look after shareholders, of course. They provide the capital. They're not going to do that if you don't look after them. But it's obscene the way, if you look at the share of a company's revenues and profits, not profits because of the way accounting works.
I was looking at a stat yesterday or something where it was like, in the past few years, companies' profits was up 47%, but salaries were up just 12%. And meanwhile, things like the rent and, all this other cost of living stuff are up about 37% or something like that.
Right.
And this is, like you're saying, this is that sort of that emphasis on that shareholder value just being overemphasized, to the point where it really has this massive ripple effect on society where, it's just that single shareholder view instead of, all the other stakeholders involved in a business, to where you get to more of that conscious, capitalism mindset in there.
Yeah.
But
that salary up stat is probably a lie as well. It's very sad. It's very sad.
Yeah, that's where I was going with that. Was exactly that. Just the way that if you look at the improvements in productivity and the increases in profits over the past, say, 50, 60 years, almost all of it is accrued to the shareholders, and it's just patently unfair. It's ridiculous, and it doesn't create the greatest society. If you, I'm not this is not my area of expertise, but I've read a bunch of stuff over the years about how if you want a society to crumble, just increase inequality, right? And at some point, if the inequality gets great enough, you end up with a revolution. Like it happened in France 200 years ago. It happened in Russia 125 years ago. So it doesn't serve any of us, really. So that's, if I was in charge of the world, that's one of the things I would change. For sure.
You've been teaching, I think you said, for 17 years, about entrepreneurship and finance. What are you noticing about the youth in response to some of these pressures that we're talking about?
Some of it's good, some of it's not so good. So I think due to probably the media and just, popular culture, TV, movies, whatever, the notion of being an entrepreneur is definitely cool. And a lot of young people are kind of drawn to that. I think they're also smart enough to realize that the idea of going and working at a company and getting a gold watch 25 years later, that's out the window. So the reality that they're going to most likely have to make their own way at some point is it's well understood. And for those that aren't, I'll give you an example of something that we do at the university. So not my department, but our creative industries department, which is exactly what it sounds like. So this is people that work in the arts, in theater and movies, even in the graphic arts and those sort of things. That department about 10, 12 years ago came to us and asked us to create some courses to help their students be more entrepreneurial, because they realize that so many of them end up being freelancers, right? So let's give them some of those skills. So, but even outside of that, I think, young people, for the most part, they do realize that it's going to be important to have some entrepreneurial skills, and they're going to have to find their own way to some degree. Now, that's the good side. The downside is that I've got 17 years of experience, and I can compare different kind of epochs, including kind of like pre-early COVID, early COVID, COVID, and post-COVID. And I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that young people today, 18, 19, coming into the university system, so out of the public school system, most of them, they are nowhere near as able to solve a problem as they were 17 years ago. And I blame the school system, and I blame parents for that. So we have a saying now. You've probably heard of helicopter parenting, right? Nope, that's not what it is now. It's bulldozer parenting. And we just bulldoze every problem out of their way, right?
Oh my goodness!
And it's not serving them.
No.
So when I was a little kid, now okay, I'm pretty old, but whatever. When I was a little kid, my mom had 2 rules, which was, be home before the street lights come on, and don't come home in a police car, and that was about it. And we made our own way, and so we were really good at solving problems. And I mean, I realize I'm from a totally different generation, but even across, the difference between, say, Gen, like the folks I'm seeing now, which are mostly, I guess, Gen Z and millennials, big difference.
Yeah, and we drank water from the hose in the backyard. Didn't have.
Right, we're all still here. Yeah. And we played with toy guns.
Exactly. Now, Brad, listen, many business owners, they tie the identity deeply to their company. I often compare this idea of being one-dimensional. But we know that life really, the fulfillment of life happens by being multidimensional. If we're just one-dimensional, you might be super successful on one thing, but you end up sacrificing other things. And even Steve Jobs, towards the end of his life, admitted to this. How can leaders stay connected to their business without being consumed by it? You've mentioned this idea of being consumed by your business. And why should they strive to also be multidimensional, in your opinion?
Several reasons. Well, first of all, I think that if you're multidimensional, it makes you more talented. So you're adding more value back to your firm. Second, if you have pursuits that are outside of the firm that you're building, it's a form of recharging the batteries, right? So, and even if it kind of feels like work, like for example, I was never on more volunteer boards than during the time when I was a publicly traded company CEO, which is kind of weird, right? Because I was busy as crazy, like busy as can be, and yet found time to do these other things. And I think it, it just makes you that much more valuable when you come step back into the office.
It's funny how that works, right? When you give yourself more, you find more time to be effective at your job. What a weird formula. People should try more of that, right?
Yeah, but it really is true. Yeah, and then finding just other sorts of pursuits to recharge the batteries, and I guess it's really mostly that, and let off steam. So, I can tell you this is a story from my corporate days, like quite a while ago now. But I had a boss come to me and he said, Brad, I wasn't quite a tyrant, but he said, I've noticed like you're a little uptight these days. And this is the best boss I ever had, by the way. So he practiced radical candor long before the book was written as well. And he said, like, what's wrong? And I go, I don't know. I don't really think anything's wrong. He goes, well, you're just not the same as you were like a year ago or whatever. And so I kind of went away and I thought about things, and I realized, I haven't been playing hockey the last couple of years. Mm. I haven't been doing any exercise whatsoever. And so I very purposefully went and joined a hockey team and started blowing off steam, and it absolutely helped. So it's you
didn't have like penalties pick up or anything, did you? Like, the slashing or the
Oh yeah. We had a few guys who thought they were still in the NHL for sure, unfortunately. And my line was always, really, I got to go to work tomorrow. Right? So
preferably what I'm missing.
That's why I wore a full cage.
Yeah, I want
all my teeth.
So, Brad, we may have touched on this a little bit earlier when we were talking about conscious capitalism, but one question we always like to ask on this show is, around kindness, kindness, care, compassion. What role do you think love should play in business?
So, I guess I'd probably point that in a bunch of different directions, right? So, like, first of all, there's love for oneself. So you kind of have to, if you're not looking after yourself, how can you possibly look after others? Mm. So how does the way that manifests is in being good to yourself, right? So eating properly, exercising, if it's the right thing for you, meditating, having pursuits outside of the office, like for me, I have my two main hobbies. I guess I got three really. One I can only do 6 months of the year because it's golf and I live in Canada. So, but we're in the middle of golf season, and I play in a band, and we're pretty busy. Like we do 50 to 60 gigs a year.
Oh, wow.
So that takes up quite a few weekends. And I practice Taekwondo, and I actually go with my grandson. So we started that 3.5 years ago, and probably within around 9 months or so, I'll have my black belt. So that, that and eating well and getting proper sleep and all that. So loving yourself, of course, right? Mm. And then practicing love toward the people that are closest to you. So again, I know people that are not that nice to their family, but then try to pretend that they're nice at work. And that just doesn't work for me. So, you know, the people that are closest to you, showing love to them in whatever the most appropriate way is. And there's too broad of a range of that to go into it. It depends on how old they are. It depends on what their needs are. You know, for example, I have two grown daughters, but they have very different needs. And so, this is actually one of my philosophies about a good leader is a chameleon, right? So a good leader knows how and what to be when. And then, like, it's kind of concentric rings. So, you know, working your way out.
Exactly.
Yeah. So through your company and then ultimately to the community, as we kind of touched on a few minutes ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that.
So, for leaders who want to develop more emotional intelligence, if they had to remember one thing from today's conversation, what would be a practical habit they should start to practice right away?
A habit. Well, for a habit, I love meditation, but I admit it's not for everybody. An awareness or a practice, I guess, would be humility. So I think humility goes a long way in terms of demonstrating emotional intelligence. So that I'm finding that to be a tough question.
No, I think that's a good answer. So, Brad, where can listeners learn more about you, your books, and your work with entrepreneurs? Where should they go?
The best place is my website because everything's linked from there. You can go on LinkedIn and just Google my name, Brad Poulos, or just go to bradpoulos.com, and the books are linked there. My blog is there. Talk about my practice and some history stuff. There's also a bunch of tools there for small business people. So things like a cash flow management system and a template for doing lean startup and a 3-year budgeting planning model. So
nice.
All right. Thank you, Brad, for joining us today. It's been a great conversation. Thank you all to our listeners as well. And I think, you know, some of this whole conversation really was in a lot of ways for leaders about loving yourself in a lot of ways. If you think about it in a healthy way. And that even means something like humility, because that's where you're going to be more open, a little less, you know, of that tyrant that can pop up every now and then, I guess. But thank you again, Brad, for joining us. Thank you to our listeners, and we will see you next time on the Bliss Business Podcast.